The night before D-Day was too calm. The wind died. The tide crept along Normandy's jagged coast in silence, washing against wire and concrete teeth. Inside the bunkers of the 716th Infantry Division, men listened to the sea breathe. Slow, steady, deceitful, Private Hans Gruber, 23, stared through a firing slit toward the channel. Nothing, just black water. His watch ticked loud enough to echo off the walls. At 03:58, a gull screamed, then the world began to shake. A low hum rolled across the horizon. Engines. Not one, not 10. Thousands. The surface of the sea trembled, rippling with shadows. Shapes appeared, endless rows of them. The greatest armada ever assembled, gliding through darkness. Then came the flash. A single burst on the horizon, then 100 more. The bombardment began. Battleships fired in perfect rhythm, lighting the sky like a chain of suns. Shells screamed overhead. The air turned to fire and sand. Bunkers cracked. Dust rained from ceilings. Men shouted through smoke that swallowed their voices. And through the chaos, Gruber looked once more through the slit. Out on the burning sea, black silhouettes were moving. Men, thousands of them, wading through surf beneath a rising red dawn. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's fortress, was breaking apart, and the men inside it were about to watch the impossible unfold. The sea no longer whispered. It screamed. Every few seconds, another salvo tore through the air. Each one closer, louder, hotter. The walls of the Atlantic Wall bunkers pulsed with each impact, concrete trembling like skin beneath a hammer. Inside, the men of the 716th Infantry Division were blind, deaf, and choking. The world had turned into sound, a sound that had weight. Private Hans Gruber pressed himself flat against the bunker floor, hands over his ears. The air smelled of cordite and lime dust. The ceiling shook again, raining sand down onto his neck. He heard his sergeant screaming something, orders probably, but the words were torn apart by the thunder outside. The men looked at each other, faces white with plaster dust, eyes wide and childlike. Then the power died. The bunker went black. For a heartbeat, there was silence. The kind that makes you think maybe, just maybe, it's over. Then a shell struck 50 meters away and the entire structure flexed. Steel supports groaned. A lamp crashed to the floor and shattered. The men dove for their helmets again as the air filled with hot dust. Somewhere in the dark, the telephone rang once, then cut out. The line to Kahn was gone. Gruber fumbled for his weapon. The metal was warm to the touch. He could taste grit between his teeth, feel it grinding against his gums. He tried to remember his training, but all that came to him was noise. The rhythm of the bombardment was so constant it began to sound like a heartbeat. Not his own, but something enormous and alive outside. Then, through the smoke, someone shouted, "Rouse! To the guns!" They stumbled out of the bunker into chaos. The sky had changed color. Gray had turned to red. Fire rose in fountains from the beach. The smell hit first, salt, oil, burning steel. The wind carried it in thick waves, a taste that stayed on the tongue. Gruber blinked through the haze and saw the sea, alive with motion, full of shapes, full of death. He had no words. Only disbelief. From horizon to horizon, the channel was filled with ships. Enormous, endless, layered in depth, so great the sea itself seemed to vanish beneath them. Some were already ablaze, others pounding the shore with relentless precision. Every second, flashes rippled across the water like lightning trapped inside clouds. Was it us? How many? No one answered. Overhead, RAF Typhoons screamed low, their wings tipped with rockets. They dived toward the coastline, loosing streaks of smoke and fire into the dunes behind the beaches. The earth lifted like cloth. In the distance, artillery from Bayeux returned fire, a meaningless gesture against the armada. The Atlantic Wall was supposed to be impregnable. For years they'd built it. Bunkers of 5-foot-thick concrete, minefields, steel hedgehogs, anti-tank ditches, flamethrowers hidden in casemates. But it had all been designed for one thing: to repel an invasion that came at the right time. Not this, not before dawn, not under a storm, not with an entire navy overhead. The men of the 716th were mostly older reservists and foreign conscripts, Poles, Czechs, Russians pressed into German uniform. Their weapons were outdated, their radios unreliable. Now they faced the full fury of modern war, alone in the dark. At 05:10, the first of the naval guns shifted aim. The shells now fell behind the first row of defenses, cutting off reinforcements. Oberfeldwebel Kurt Weiss, commanding the nearest machine gun nest, saw the pattern change and realized what was happening. He grabbed his field phone, dead. The line was gone. He looked to the west. Nothing but fire and smoke. He turned back toward the sea and froze. Shapes were emerging from the mist. Flat-bottomed black silhouettes moving in waves. Landing craft. "Here they come," he muttered. His voice was calm, almost disbelieving. He shouldered his MG-42, sighted down the barrel. "Wait for range." "Wait!" Then the entire world exploded again. Shells from the ships tore into the seawall just as the first wave approached. Huge columns of sand and water rose 20 meters high, falling in sheets that hissed as they landed. When the smoke cleared, Weiss saw them. Men wading ashore through chest-deep surf, packs and rifles held high, faces streaked with camouflage. They were everywhere. British at Gold Beach, Canadians at Juneau. He could see their flags painted on helmets, red, white, blue, moving forward in steady, mechanical rhythm. Weiss opened fire. The MG-42 roared, a continuous metallic scream. Tracers cut bright arcs across the water. He saw one man fall, then another, then the rest disappear into the surf. But they kept coming. For every one who fell, 5 more took his place. He changed the barrel, smoke pouring from the vent. His loader was gone. A shell had taken him seconds earlier. He didn't stop. He fired until the sandbag wall in front of him disintegrated, until the gun's tripod rattled loose. To his right, a mortar team tried to engage. Their first round detonated short, killing them instantly. To his left, a flamethrower team screamed as their tank was hit, erupting into orange fire that turned their bunker into a furnace. The noise was beyond hearing, not sound but pressure, hammering against the chest like a physical force, and still, the Allies advanced. By 06R, the first wave had reached the beach obstacles. Engineers carrying Bangalore torpedoes crawled forward, sliding long metal tubes into the sand. Weiss saw them, recognized what they were doing, and tried to swing the gun. Too late. The explosions rolled across the shore in a single chain. Steel hedgehogs flipped into the air. Barbed wire snapped like string. A gap opened through the wall of obstacles and the Allied infantry poured through. Weiss ducked as a tank shell slammed into his position. The blast blew him backward into the concrete wall, ears ringing, nose bleeding. He staggered up, dazed. The bunker's front slit was gone, only smoke and daylight. Through the hole, he saw a Sherman tank climbing the sandbank, its treads grinding over mines that failed to detonate. On its hull was a painted word, Avenger. He reached for his Panzerfaust, empty. The next shell hit before he could move. The bunker collapsed. Further inland, General Wilhelm Richter stood in his command post near Caen, maps strewn across his table. Reports came in broken, fragmented, full of screams and static. Gold Beach, lost contact. Juneau sector collapsing. Battery Montfleury destroyed. Richter slammed his fist down. "Where are the reserves? Where are the panzers?" His adjutant hesitated. "They're waiting on authorization from Berlin." Richter stared at him, pale. Authorization? They'll have Caen by nightfall. But the order never came. Hitler was asleep. By the time he woke and allowed the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend to move, the beaches were already secured. Back at the shoreline, Gruber crawled from the rubble. He coughed black smoke, spat blood into the sand. All around him, everything was burning. The air shimmered with heat. The sound of bullets whipping overhead was constant. He dragged himself to what was left of a trench and looked out. The sea was gone. The beach was filled with men, Allied soldiers in endless ranks advancing inland behind their tanks and half-tracks. Flags fluttered in the wind. Orders were shouted in English, drowned by gunfire. He could see medics tending the wounded right there on the sand, ignoring the danger. For a moment he simply stared, mesmerized. It looked less like a battle than a force of nature, a tide of humanity rolling forward. Behind him, a wounded officer tried to crawl toward a discarded radio. "Get a message out," he rasped. Tell them the wall is gone." But there was no one left to tell. At 07:15, the last functioning German strongpoint near Courseulles fell. The survivors, maybe 20 men out of 300, stumbled inland through hedgerows already swarming with Allied scouts. The once proud Atlantic Wall, designed to hold for months, had lasted barely 4 hours. The sky cleared briefly, revealing the fleet in its entirety. thousands of ships glittering in sunlight stretching to the horizon. It looked endless, divine, unstoppable. Gruber sank to his knees in the sand. The war he thought he understood had vanished in a single morning. Around him, British soldiers moved among the ruins, checking bunkers, gathering prisoners. One of them, a boy no older than he was, stopped, looked at him, and lowered his rifle. "Get up, mate," the soldier said softly, his accent foreign but not cruel. Gruber raised his hands. The wind off the sea carried the sound of gulls, and somewhere beyond the smoke, bagpipes began to play. The Atlantic wall had fallen, not from weakness but from the weight of history itself, and as the morning sun rose higher, its light touched the faces of two armies. One broken, one reborn, both staring at each other across the sands of Normandy. For the men of the 716th Infantry Division, the war had changed forever. For the world, it had just begun again. By the time the sun climbed fully above the horizon, the sea no longer looked like water. It looked like movement, alive, endless, metallic. From Arromanches to Ouistreham, the English Channel was no longer an ocean but a road. Ships stacked bow to stern, stretching beyond the curve of the world. Everywhere, the tide was made of men. Tanks and carriers rolled from landing craft, churning through the surf as engineers shouted directions over the scream of engines. Men with shovels, radios, stretchers, rifles, a human machine in perfect, unstoppable rhythm. The invasion had become a single living organism, and its heartbeat was the steady crash of boots against sand. For the first time in history, an entire continent was beginning to turn back. Private Hans Gruber stumbled through what had once been his sector, now a graveyard of bunkers and broken metal. The air shimmered with heat. Every step sank into sand churned red and black. Around him, the last pockets of resistance were collapsing one by one. The 716th Infantry Division was no longer a division. It was a memory. He looked back once toward the sea. It was almost beautiful. Landing craft moved in perfect choreography, waves of men still pouring ashore. He could see medics carrying stretchers, bulldozers clearing obstacles, tanks crawling forward like armored beasts. Every few minutes, a distant boom rolled across the water, the guns of HMS Belfast still pounding targets inland. He realized, with a kind of dull wonder, that no one was coming to help them. The panzers were too far away. The Luftwaffe was gone. The once invincible Wehrmacht had been reduced to whispers on a broken radio. Somewhere beyond the dunes he heard shouting, English, rapid and sharp. He pressed himself into a shell crater and waited. Through the drifting smoke, a group of Canadian soldiers appeared, rifles raised, moving with deliberate caution. They swept the trench methodically, covering each other, faces streaked with mud. Gruber held his breath. He thought about the picture of his daughter in his breast pocket. He thought about the order pinned on his bunker wall. Hold until relieved. But there was no one left to relieve him. He raised his hands. The Canadians didn't fire. One of them, barely 20, motioned him out with the barrel of his rifle. Gruber climbed from the trench, shaking. The soldier searched him quickly, then pointed inland. "Go, move." Gruber began to walk. Behind him, the beach roared with the rhythm of victory. Ahead, the fields of Normandy stretched green and endless, a landscape he had sworn to defend, now utterly alien. For the Allies, the real battle was just beginning. Behind the first waves, engineers landed with bulldozers and cranes. They built roads directly on the beach, paths of planks and crushed stone leading inland. Communications officers unspooled miles of cable, connecting field telephones to ships offshore. Chaplains knelt beside the dying. Cooks set up stoves. Doctors built hospitals from tents and wreckage. Within hours, the beaches of Normandy had become a living city. From the ships, cranes lowered Sherman tanks, half-tracks, and jeeps one after another, their treads sinking into sand as crews leapt aboard. Overhead, C-47 Dakotas roared toward the horizon, still dropping paratroopers and supplies to the chaos inland. The air was filled with parachutes, white, green, orange, drifting like confetti over fields. An American engineer looked up, wiping sweat from his brow. "Jesus," he murmured. "It's like it's raining men." It wasn't exaggeration. By noon, over 130,000 Allied troops were on French soil, the beginning of an army that would reach millions. The Germans had never seen anything like it. Inland, Chaos ruled. The remains of the 716th retreated through hedgerows and narrow farm roads, their uniforms blackened by smoke. Most carried no weapons, only exhaustion. Some stumbled upon the wreckage of their own artillery, overturned and silent. Others found dead comrades still gripping rifles, staring sightlessly toward the coast. General Wilhelm Richter, his uniform torn, finally reached a field headquarters near Krilly. Maps lay scattered across the floor, officers arguing over nothing. "What units do we have left?" he demanded. A captain hesitated. "Fragments of the 736th Regiment, perhaps 50 men. Communications with the 21st Panzer Division are intermittent." Richter exhaled slowly. He knew the truth. The Atlantic Wall was no longer a wall. It was a wound, and that wound was bleeding men and machines into the heart of France. He turned toward the east, toward Caen, where smoke already rose on the horizon. "Tell Berlin," he said softly. "Tell them it's over." But Berlin wasn't listening. As the sun climbed higher, Allied troops began pushing inland. Every field, every hedgerow became a small war. British commandos advanced along narrow roads toward Bayeux, ambushed by German machine gunners hidden among apple orchards. Canadian riflemen moved through flooded fields where every step could hide a mine. The land itself fought them. The hedgerows of Normandy, thick, ancient, woven with earth and stone, became natural fortresses. Tanks couldn't see over them. Infantry couldn't see through them. Every advance meant blood. Still, the Allies pressed on. Major John Tilley of the Royal Hampshire Regiment crouched behind a stone wall, smoke curling above him. "Push through the hedges," he shouted. "Don't stop until we reach the ridge." A shell exploded nearby, spraying dirt across his face. He blinked, spat, and waved his men forward. Behind them, the constant rumble of naval guns thundered like a heartbeat. One soldier muttered, "It's like God himself's on our side." By mid-afternoon, the beaches were almost unrecognizable. What had been chaos at dawn was now order. Convoys of trucks unloading ammunition, water, fuel. Engineers laid down temporary airstrips using pierced steel planking. Military police directed traffic with whistles. Chaplains led prayers over rows of covered bodies. The sea itself carried the dead gently back to shore. Admiral Ramsay, watching from the bridge of his flagship, whispered to his aide, "It's working. My God, it's actually working." Behind him, radio operators logged constant transmissions, code names, coordinates, new orders. The machine of war was functioning perfectly, turning death into progress, chaos into precision. Far inland, Gruber found himself among other prisoners, maybe 50 in total, sitting in a field surrounded by barbed wire and British guards. Some were silent. Others wept. One man, missing an arm, just stared at his handless sleeve. A British officer walked along the line, cigarette in hand. "You're lucky," he said quietly. "If our bombers had been on schedule, you'd all be gone." Gruber didn't answer. He looked up and saw a formation of C-47s flying overhead, parachutes blooming behind them. They looked peaceful from this distance, white petals in the sky. He thought of Leipzig, of the fields near his home. They looked the same. War was strange like that. It could turn any landscape into memory. By evening, the Allied front stretched 10 miles inland. The beaches now bore new names: Gold, Juno, Sword, Omaha, Utah. Each had its own cost. Each was a graveyard that would never be empty again. But they were secure, and that meant victory. Radio operators aboard the HMS Belfast sent the signal to London. The invasion has succeeded. Across the Channel, in the war rooms beneath Whitehall, Winston Churchill exhaled for the first time in 24 hours. "We've gained a foothold," he said. "Now we must build a bridgehead, a bridge to freedom." The Atlantic Wall, the masterpiece of Nazi engineering, lay in ruins. The myth of invincibility had been broken in a single day. For the Germans, the question was no longer how to stop it. It was how long can we survive it. That night, the beaches glowed under the light of burning wrecks and parachute flares. The tide rolled in quietly, washing over boots, rifles, helmets. The ocean that had brought death now whispered again, gentle, indifferent. Private Hans Gruber sat in the prisoner pen, staring at the horizon. He could still hear distant gunfire inland, echoing off the hills. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure who he was: soldier, prisoner, survivor, ghost. He reached into his pocket and felt the photograph of his daughter, crumpled, but intact. For a long moment he stared at it, then looked up toward the sky. The clouds had broken. Stars shone through the drifting smoke. Somewhere beyond them, 1,000 miles away, the lights of Germany still burned, dim, trembling, waiting for news that would never come. The thunder of the sea faded behind them. Now the sound came from the earth. The roads of Normandy were narrow, sunken between thick hedgerows that rose like walls of living green. In those hedgerows, death waited. The beaches had been chaos. The fields were worse, intimate, suffocating, close. By the morning of June 7th, Allied units pushing inland found themselves entering a maze of earth and foliage. The hedgerows, centuries old, built by farmers long before any of them were born, were perfect for defense. Roots as thick as wrists packed with stones rising 6 feet high. Each one hid a German machine gun, a sniper, a mortar team. The 716th Infantry Division, or what remained of it, had scattered into these hedges. Joined now by elements of the 21st Panzer Division, they began to fight back. The battle for Caen had begun. At dawn, mist rolled low over the fields near Buren. The first British tanks appeared through the fog, Sherman Fireflies, their long 17-pounder guns cutting silhouettes like church spires against the haze. Infantry followed, crouched low, weapons ready, moving yard by yard. In a nearby orchard, SS Sturmbannführer Kurt Meyer of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend studied the scene through binoculars. He was 33, tall, clean-shaven, with a calmness that made his men believe he couldn't die. Around him, the young soldiers of the Hitlerjugend, barely 18, some younger, whispered nervously, gripping rifles that looked too big for them. Meyer lowered the binoculars. "Wait until they pass the hedge," he said quietly. "Then we cut them." He lit a cigarette, the ember glowing briefly against the pale morning. The British line crept closer, unaware. A bird sang somewhere in the fog. Then the first MG-42 opened fire. The field exploded in noise. Bullets shredded leaves, tore bark from trees. Mortar shells burst overhead, raining hot fragments through the mist. The British infantry dropped flat, shouting to each other, firing blindly into the hedgerow. Tanks fired point blank into the green wall, turning it into flying dirt and splinters. The air filled with the stench of gunpowder and sap. A Sherman Firefly lurched forward, its treads grinding through the ditch. From the next field, a Panzer IV rose like a shadow from the earth. They saw each other almost simultaneously. 2 guns fired. 2 flashes. Only one hit. The Sherman exploded in a roar of orange flame, its turret blown sideways into the field. Black smoke coiled upward, thick and oily. British troops scrambled for cover, their advance collapsing into confusion. Meyer smiled grimly. Caen will not fall today. By midday, the Norman countryside had become a labyrinth of ambushes. The Allies advanced yard by yard, sometimes only 50 meters an hour. Every hedgerow was a fortress, every tree a sniper's nest. The bodies of men and cattle lay side by side in the ditches, both unrecognizable. Captain Alan Lorne, commanding B Company of the Royal Norfolk Regiment, crouched beside a burning tank. He looked at the map, useless. The landscape was unrecognizable, the fields twisting into one another, no line of sight, no clear objective. He turned to his sergeant. "We're supposed to reach Caen by nightfall." The sergeant looked at him hollow-eyed. "Sir, Caen might as well be on the moon." A shell burst nearby, throwing them both into the mud. Lorne staggered up, dazed. His ears rang, his uniform soaked with blood, not his own. He could hear wounded men crying in the hedges, calling for medics who would never find them. He pressed forward anyway. Because stopping wasn't an option. In the German lines there was no triumph, only endurance. The 12th SS fought with ferocity, but supplies were short. Ammunition was rationed, communication fragmented. Artillery support came sporadically when it came at all. The sky belonged to the Allies now. Whenever German armor tried to move in daylight, Typhoon fighter bombers swooped down from the clouds, rockets screaming. Gruber, now pressed into service as a stretcher-bearer, witnessed one such attack near Authie. The panzer column had just begun to move when the sky split open. A sound like tearing cloth, then streaks of smoke. Rockets struck the lead tank, peeling it open like tin. Men bailed out on fire. One ran past Gruber, arms outstretched, face black with soot, screaming for water. There was none. Gruber dragged him behind a wall, but it didn't matter. The man was already gone. Around them, the fields burned. Aircraft circled overhead like hawks. He realized the Allies didn't just have more men. They had the sky itself. That night, both sides dug in. The fields glowed orange with fires. The air smelled of oil, cordite, and crushed grass. Somewhere to the north, naval guns still rumbled, distant thunder rolling over the horizon. In the British lines, soldiers smoked quietly, faces lit by embers. Someone played a harmonica. Someone else wrote a letter home, hands trembling too hard to form words. In the German positions, whispers moved through the trenches. They spoke of the Atlantic Wall gone, of Paris already in Allied hands, rumors born from fear. Command tried to hold discipline, but the truth hung in the air like the smell of blood. They were losing. By June 10th, the fields around Buren, Authie, and Abbé Dardenne had become slaughter grounds. The Allies pushed again, supported by tanks and air power. The Germans counterattacked, fighting like wolves trapped in a cage. The Hitlerjugend Division earned its name that week, not for victory but for fury. In one orchard, British soldiers discovered what was left of a Canadian platoon, executed after capture. The news spread like wildfire. No quarter would be given now, the battle hardened. It became personal. Major Tilly, now commanding remnants of 3 shattered companies, gathered his men near a farmhouse south of Carpiquet. His uniform was caked in dust, his voice raw. "They're dug in deep," he said, pointing toward the map. "We go through, not around. The armor's following in 5. A corporal muttered, "They'll be waiting, sir." Tilly nodded. "They always are." The attack began at dawn. Fog drifted low, clinging to the fields. Tanks rolled forward, guns blazing. Infantry followed close, firing into hedgerows that spat flame in return. The sound of engines, gunfire, and men shouting merged into a single endless roar. Tilly ran beside a Sherman, his boots sinking in mud. A shell burst ahead, showering him with earth. He wiped his face and kept going. A Panzer appeared at the crossroads, dark, smoking, alive. It fired once. The Sherman vanished in flame. Men flew like rag dolls. Tilly crawled forward through burning wheat, screaming for his men to advance. Through the smoke he saw shapes, Germans retreating, others still firing. He didn't know which was which anymore. The hedgerow erupted beside him. He fell, bleeding. When he woke, it was night. The battle had moved on. The field was quiet except for the groans of the dying. The wheat around him glowed faintly with embers. The air stank of metal and death. He stared at the stars and thought of home. By the end of June, Caen still stood. It was rubble, but it stood. The Allies had expected to take it in a day. It had taken a month. Every street was mined, every wall defended. The city burned for weeks, and through it all, the soldiers on both sides fought not for victory but for survival. For the Germans, this was the last stand of belief, the conviction that somehow, through will alone, they could hold back the world. For the Allies, it was the first real taste of what liberation would cost. On July 9th, after 33 days of fighting, Caen finally fell. British troops entered the ruins at dawn. The city was silent, only the sound of boots crunching on glass, the distant cough of engines. Rubble piled higher than houses. Smoke drifted like ghosts between broken church spires. A soldier picked up a child's doll from the debris, its porcelain face cracked in half. He set it gently on a windowsill and kept walking. In a shattered courtyard, a small group of German prisoners huddled under guard, the last of the 12th SS in Caen. Among them sat Hans Gruber, his uniform blackened, his face unreadable. He looked up as the British passed, and for the first time in weeks he saw sunlight that wasn't from fire. He thought of all that had been lost. His comrades, his home, the illusion of invincibility. And in that moment he realized the war had changed. Not just in strategy or power, but in spirit. The walls were gone, physical and otherwise. What remained was only endurance. The camera rises slowly above the ruins of Caen, smoke curling like breath from the earth. The river glints below, lined with twisted steel and shattered bridges. The sky is gray but wide open. Somewhere far off, artillery still rumbles, the sound of a world remade through fire. The iron fields of Normandy had taken everything: youth, hope, and certainty. But they had also given something back. The truth that war, stripped of myth, was only survival and memory. The smoke above Caen lingered for days, a permanent cloud, thick enough to block the sun. It hung low over the Norman countryside, curling and folding upon itself like the breath of something dying. The battle for Caen was over. But the war for France had just begun. At dawn on July 18, 1944, the world ended again, this time from the sky. All across the British sector, soldiers looked up as the clouds began to rumble. It wasn't thunder. It was engines, hundreds, thousands of them, flying fortresses and Lancasters, an iron armada glinting in the morning light. They filled the heavens from horizon to horizon, moving in perfect formation. The men on the ground went silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. Then the first bombs fell. The city of Caen, what remained of it, vanished in light. A pressure wave rolled across the fields, flattening grass, bending trees. Columns of dust rose miles high, blending with the smoke already there. Every second brought a new explosion, the earth trembling beneath the weight of 10,000 detonations. The operation had a name: Goodwood. Its purpose: to shatter the German lines east of Caen and open the road to Falaise. To those below, it felt like the world was being erased. Private Hans Gruber was there, a prisoner working under guard, clearing debris from a collapsed barn on the outskirts of the city. When the bombing began, the guards shoved them into a trench, shouting over the noise. Gruber pressed himself into the dirt, hands over his head. The air turned white hot. It wasn't just sound. It was force, a physical thing pressing down, squeezing the breath from his lungs. He couldn't see the planes, only feel them. 1,000 invisible gods rewriting the map above his head. When the bombing finally stopped, silence returned slowly. Not peace, but absence. The sky still glowed orange, filled with drifting embers. Caen was gone again, this time completely. The guards helped them up. One of them, a young British corporal, stared at the horizon and muttered, "Bloody hell." "We did that," Gruber said nothing. There was nothing to say. East of Caen, the British Second Army began its advance, 8th Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Richard O'Connor, leading the way. 3 armored divisions rolled forward: Guards, 11th Armored and 7th Armored, Desert Rats. Over 1,000 tanks. They moved through what had once been open farmland, now reduced to ash. The tracks of their vehicles raised curtains of dust mingling with the smoke. Above them, Allied Typhoons prowled like hawks, hunting anything that moved. The German defense was already shattered. The bombing had annihilated entire battalions before they could even form up. Survivors stumbled through craters, deaf and blind, weapons useless. The 21st Panzer Division and remnants of the 12th SS Hitlerjugend tried to regroup along the Bourget-Bus Ridge. But their lines were ghosts, positions marked on maps that no longer existed on the earth. Still, they fought. Obersturmführer Ernst Werner, commanding what was left of his panzer company, stood beside a burned-out tank near Canny. His radio hissed static. The fields ahead were on fire, dotted with twisted wreckage and men who no longer moved. He could hear British engines approaching, a low mechanical growl rolling through the smoke. He turned to his loader. "How many shells left?" "3, sir," Werner nodded. "Then we make them count." The first British tank appeared, a Cromwell, its turret sweeping left and right. Werner waited until it crested the rise, then fired. The shot hit square, the Cromwell erupting in smoke. A second tank appeared behind it, missed. The third shot jammed in the breach. Werner cursed, grabbed a wrench, tried to pry it free. Too late. The return fire hit, lifting the turret off its ring. When the smoke cleared, the tank was gone. So was Werner. To the men on the ground, Operation Goodwood was less a battle than a storm, one that rolled across Normandy like a living creature. For the British tank crews, it was chaos. Smoke thick enough to blot out the sun. Visibility near zero. The smell of burning fuel everywhere. Some tanks drove straight into German positions without realizing it. Others were destroyed by friendly fire. The radio channels were jammed with static and screams. Still they moved. Because momentum was everything. From the ridge above Bourget-Bus, General Wilhelm Richter, still commanding fragments of the 716th and 21st Panzer Divisions, watched the British advance. He had no reserves left, no air support, and barely any ammunition. His once proud division now numbered fewer than 1,000 men. He picked up his field glasses and saw it. A line of British armor stretching beyond sight, their guns glinting like sunlight on water. He whispered to his adjutant, "This is not war, this is judgment." Then he ordered the last artillery battery to fire. The barrage lasted 10 minutes. Then silence again. And then the sky returned. This time it wasn't bombers, and it was typhoons, hundreds of them. Their engines screamed as they dove, unleashing rockets that tore through the German positions. The ground erupted in geysers of fire. Tanks flipped like toys, trucks disintegrated. Men vanished. To the Allied troops below, the sight was awe and terror combined. Even hardened veterans stopped to watch as rockets struck targets with surgical precision. One British gunner whispered to his friend, "Christ Almighty. Look at them burn." The friend didn't answer. He was too busy staring, not with pride but disbelief. He had seen fire before, but never like this. Never so total. By afternoon, the German defense east of Caen ceased to exist. The survivors, those few who could still walk, fled toward Falaise, leaving wrecks and bodies behind them. British tanks rolled forward through what looked less like countryside and more like another planet. Black soil, twisted metal, craters large enough to swallow houses. Over the radio, O'Connor's voice was calm, deliberate. Objective Bourguebus achieved. Casualties heavy. German armor eliminated. London celebrated. But the men on the ground didn't. They were too tired, too hollow. One tank commander climbed out of his hatch, removed his headset, and just sat there, watching the fires. His face was streaked with soot. His hands shook. "We've won, haven't we?" someone asked. He didn't answer. For the Germans, the collapse was spiritual. Messages from the front grew shorter, more frantic. No ammunition. No contact with HQ. The line has dissolved. The once proud Wehrmacht, masters of blitzkrieg, were now fighting like ghosts. Outnumbered and outgunned on every front. Gruber, still a prisoner, watched the retreat from behind British lines. He saw German trucks fleeing under Allied aircraft, caught and destroyed one after another. The explosions lit the night sky like a macabre aurora. Even as a captive, his heart twisted, not from loyalty but from the recognition of an ending. The Reich had built itself on invincibility. Now it was burning. By late July, the fields of Normandy were transformed into an infernal wasteland. Smoke pillars marked every horizon. Roads were littered with wrecked vehicles, both Allied and German, indistinguishable under the same coating of ash. The smell was constant, a mixture of oil, death, and summer heat. Flies gathered in clouds. Soldiers walked past them without looking. There was no time for mourning anymore. For the Allies, the next objective was clear: breakout. For the Germans, it was simpler: survive. August 1st, 1944. The American First Army, led by General Omar Bradley, launched Operation Cobra west of St. Lo. It was everything the Germans feared and more. Over 500 bombers struck a narrow front, obliterating the landscape. When the dust cleared, the American tanks rolled forward unopposed. Normandy was no longer a battlefield. It was a corridor, one that led straight to Paris. The 716th, or what fragments remained, retreated in disarray. Their once iron discipline was gone. Men marched barefoot. Officers abandoned vehicles. The sound of engines and pursuit haunted them by night. Gruber walked among them under guard, watching his own army dissolve before his eyes. It was like seeing a glacier melt, something ancient, immense, undone by time and pressure. In the skies above them, Allied aircraft still hunted. Bombers during the day, fighters at dusk. The sun itself seemed to belong to the enemy. Once, as they crossed an open field near Falaise, Gruber looked up and saw hundreds of contrails stretching across the blue, white scars marking the heavens. For a moment, he thought they were beautiful. Then a rocket struck the road ahead, turning beauty into ruin again. The war had become an endless pattern of creation and destruction, each one feeding the next. By mid-August, the Allies had surrounded the German 7th Army in what would be called the Falaise Pocket. Tens of thousands trapped. Tanks, trucks, horses, and men, all crushed into a valley that became a grave. The stench carried for miles. The ground turned black. British, Canadian, and Polish forces closed from the north. Americans from the south. Artillery thundered from all sides. There was no escape. It was here that the last fragments of the 716th Infantry Division ceased to exist. Some were captured, some fled. Many simply vanished, consumed by the fire. Gruber survived by accident. A collapsed barn, a British guard pulling him free. When the battle ended, he stood on a hill overlooking the valley. Below, the wreckage of the German army lay spread out like a broken machine. Hundreds of vehicles tangled together, bodies uncountable, the smoke rising in gentle spirals. He whispered to himself, "The wall is gone, not the Atlantic wall, the wall inside them, the one that had told them they could not lose, that history itself was theirs to command." That wall had fallen at last. As night fell, the fires burned quietly across Normandy, marking the path of the armies that would soon march to Paris. The air shimmered with heat. The sound of engines faded into the distance. Above, the stars reappeared, countless, cold, eternal. The sky was clear again, cleansed by fire, and beneath it, the last survivors of the Atlantic Wall, German, British, Canadian, American, all shared the same silence, the same exhaustion, the same understanding, that the war had entered its final, terrible chapter. The sky itself had turned against man. The fires of Normandy burned for weeks. Even after the guns fell silent, the earth still smoked. The air smelled of oil and rot and victory, a smell that clung to the skin, to the fabric of uniforms, to memory itself. By mid-August 1944, the German army in the West was gone. What remained was a procession of ghosts, hollow-eyed soldiers trudging along country roads that led nowhere. Trucks sputtered to a halt from lack of fuel. Horses pulled carts piled with the wounded. Radios crackled only static, and overhead always the drone of aircraft and the voice of inevitability. In the valley of Falaise, the full weight of defeat took form. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were trapped in a space no wider than 10 miles, surrounded on all sides by British, Canadian, Polish, and American forces. The air was thick with smoke, dust, and the stench of decay. Private Hans Gruber, still a prisoner laboring under British supervision, watched from a ridge as the valley burned. Through the haze, he could see columns of men trying to flee, running, crawling, driving, only to be caught by shellfire or aircraft strafing runs. The ground rippled under constant bombardment. The noise was ceaseless, mechanical, godlike. He could see German tanks attempting to push through the chaos, engines roaring, treads chewing through the corpses of horses and men. One by one, they were hit, rockets striking with precision, explosions lifting them from the ground. It wasn't a battle anymore. It was extermination. The Allies had closed the trap. The Falaise pocket was sealed. At the center of the maelstrom, General Wilhelm Richter stood beside the wreckage of his command car. His uniform was torn, his face black with soot. The last of his staff were gone. He leaned against a burned-out tree and stared across the valley, a landscape of horror beyond language. Trucks overturned, wagons shattered, livestock burned alive, men clawing at the mud to dig graves for comrades who would never fit into the earth. Overhead, Allied Typhoons still circled, firing into anything that moved. A soldier ran toward him, shouting, "Herr General!" "The Canadians are at Trun. We must go east." Richter looked at him with empty eyes. "East?" he murmured. "There is no east anymore." A shell landed nearby, flinging both men into the dirt. Richter didn't rise again. By nightfall on August 21st, the guns stopped. The valley was silent except for the crackle of flames and the distant sob of the wounded. The Battle of Falaise was over. The cost, 60,000 Germans killed, wounded, or captured. The fields of Normandy were littered with the wreckage of an army, and the proof that the war had turned irreversibly. The Atlantic Wall had fallen in June. Now, the Reich's western heart had fallen with it. The camera drifts eastward, over fields still smoking, through the ruined villages of Normandy, along roads lined with endless convoys of Allied trucks. Soldiers wave from jeeps. Medics load stretchers into ambulances. The machine of liberation is in motion. Through the same roads, columns of German prisoners march in the opposite direction. They move silently, eyes down, boots shuffling in dust. Farmers watch from doorways, arms crossed. Some spit, some turn away. Among them walks Hans Gruber. He no longer feels fear. Only emptiness, a hollow space where duty used to be. Around him, men whisper rumors. Paris has fallen. The Allies are crossing the Seine, the war is lost, he doesn't reply. The words don't matter anymore. Paris, August 25th, 1944. Church bells ring for the first time in 4 years. Crowds flood the boulevards, waving tricolors, climbing on tanks, throwing flowers at soldiers. The 2nd French Armored Division and the 4th U.S. Infantry Division roll through the city under a rain of confetti and gunfire. From the balcony of the Hôtel de Ville, General Charles de Gaulle addresses the crowd. Paris, Paris outraged, Paris broken, Paris martyred, but Paris liberated. The roar of the people drowns his voice. Tears, laughter, the sound of freedom reborn. The city that had lived in silence now sings again. But beneath the cheers, a quieter sound persists. The low rumble of trucks carrying prisoners west, the steady beat of boots marching east. Liberation and defeat share the same roads. In a makeshift camp near Argentan, Gruber sits beneath barbed wire, watching the sunset. The sky glows the same orange as the fires of Falaise, but now it feels distant, almost gentle. The British guard who watches him offers a cigarette. Gruber takes it, lights it, exhales slowly. The smoke drifts upward, disappearing into the twilight. "You were at the wall?" the guard asks. "Yes," Gruber answers. "Hell of a thing." "Yes," he says again. They sit in silence for a while. The war is still raging somewhere beyond the horizon, but here, for this brief moment, there's nothing left to fight over. Far to the east, the German High Command reels. Field Marshal von Kluge is dead, suicide on the road to Metz. Hitler rants from his bunker, demanding counterattacks that no longer exist. The Western Front is a mirage. Divisions exist only on paper. In London, Churchill writes in his diary, "The tide of war has turned for the last time. The Hun is broken, and yet even victory feels heavy. Too many names, too many fields filled with crosses that have no nation." In the weeks that follow, the Allied advance becomes a flood. Through Belgium, Holland, toward the Siegfried Line itself. The roads are lined with French villagers waving flags, handing out bread and wine, crying and singing. Behind them, the wreckage of 4 years of occupation smolders quietly. War photographers capture everything. Children climbing onto tanks, women embracing soldiers, old men weeping beside graves. The world will see these images and call them freedom. But those who were there know freedom has a price. The camera lingers on one photograph. A young German prisoner looking directly at the lens, eyes hollow but unflinching. The caption will read only, "Normandy, 1944. But in his gaze, the entire century lives. As autumn comes, the rains return. The fields of Normandy turn green again. The wreckage rusts. Graves are marked with wooden crosses. Farmers plow around them. Life continues." In a hospital tent near Bayeux, Allied nurses tend to both sides, British, Canadian, German, wounds indistinguishable beneath the bandages. One nurse writes in her diary, "The uniforms change, but the pain does not. War," she realizes, "isn't made of nations. It's made of faces." Hans Gruber spends the winter in a POW camp in southern England. It rains constantly. The guards are young and polite. The food is strange but plentiful. He learns English from a Red Cross leaflet. Sometimes he hears the BBC broadcast news of the Eastern Front. Russians at the gates of Warsaw. Americans crossing the Rhine. The war is finishing itself without him. At night he dreams of the sea, not calm, but burning. The roar of engines, the thunder of shells, the first glimpse of men rising from the water under the dawn sky. He always wakes at the same moment, the flash of the first bombardment. The moment the world changed forever. He never dreams past it. In May 1945, the war ends. Germany surrenders. The Reich collapses into dust. Gruber is still alive, still a prisoner, still staring at the horizon. When the news reaches the camp, there is no celebration, only silence. Some men cry, some laugh. Most simply stare. They had been fighting for so long that peace feels like another kind of weapon. Heavy, unfamiliar. A British officer enters the barracks, removes his cap, and says quietly, "It's over." The words hang in the air like the last echo of a shell. Years later, long after the guns have rusted and the ruins have been rebuilt, tourists will walk the beaches of Normandy. They will see the remnants of bunkers, the twisted metal of obstacles, the names etched into stone memorials. They will stand on the cliffs and feel the wind from the sea and try to imagine what it was like. But they will never quite hear it. The sound of the Atlantic Wall collapsing, the sound of history breaking apart under its own weight. Only the survivors heard that sound, and for the rest of their lives it would never fully fade. The camera pulls back one final time, over the quiet fields of Normandy, over Caen rebuilt and shining in the sun, over the beaches now calm again, the tide whispering against sand as if nothing ever happened. The sea glimmers softly, the same sea that once carried 1,000 ships and 100,000 men, the same sea that once turned red, and as the wind moves through the grass it sounds almost like voices, distant, uncountable, echoing across time. The voices of those who built the wall, and those who broke it,